I'm really excited to be here, and I'm also very grateful to be an uninvited guest on the Coast Salish territory, and to be able to speak to you at VIU tonight. Yeah, I think I'm going to try to give you an overview of some of the work that I've done, some work that I really admire, and try to map out some of the possibilities of what this way of working can mean and can do for a community. So we're going to start with a little I guess remedial thing, maybe, defining a public or defining publics. This is a quote that comes from a really interesting architect and writer, Marcus Meeson. One of my favorite books, The Nightmare of Participation. And it's one of my favorites because it's kind of a challenging proposition. We assume that there's a lot of good in participation, but there's also a lot of things that happen that get collapsed when we wait for participation, right? When we wait for someone to be like, oh, now you can come and have some input. It means we're not kind of taking up the space for ourselves, right? We're not taking enough agency in life about this. So his kind of call to arms, I guess, don't wait to be invited, otherwise things will never happen, I think is very true. And I would challenge you to kind of, if you take nothing else away tonight, from what I say, please follow Marcus Meeson's call here. And I guess I would maybe add is that a public is made up of decisions that are made either by citizens or for citizens, right? And there's a crucial difference there, right? There's a crucial difference. It's decisions made by the people or decisions made for the people, and I think we want to aim for the former, right? Okay, here's the next one. Okay, so you've seen Seinfeld. Have you seen this show? This is one of the times George Costanza, exclaims, "We're living in a society," and I think that his frustration is compelling for a number of reasons. But in particular, the idea that what is civilized, what is society, is up for grabs, right? It's not a fixed thing. We do it every day. We're making it. We are negotiating differences and negotiating affinities and negotiating potentialities every single day. And as we do that, that is society. That's civic life. And if we take for granted that it's something that's there, that's waiting, it's kind of calling us over, waiting for us, again, I think we're kind of missing the point. Maybe most of all, though, I think defining public, and in turn defining what a public can or should or ought not to do, is about finding ways to understand and draw out points of resonance and points of meaning, right? How we act, what we act towards, what we try and get done in the world is a bit of a measure of what we value in the world around us. And maybe the things we decide not to do is an equal measure, but I mean, most interestingly, I think that we're all trying to do this, right? We're all trying to make sense of where we live and how we live. And I think that those aspects of defining public in relation to things that matter to us and things that trouble us and things that we want and things we don't want are kind of like really interesting to have a sense of like lived experience around. Okay, so part of what we're going to talk about tonight is like what is public art, or what's it doing? What's it not doing? What do we hope it could do? And I think that public art tries to make a sense of place almost above all else, right? So I'm going to flip through a few images here. This is Edgar, Heap of Birds. This is a work that's on the UBC campus. And, British Columbia, today your host is Squamish. This is a series of signs that denotes the various indigenous communities that are in and around Vancouver and much of BC. And I think that this is an interesting way to certainly acknowledge what public is defined as, maybe in a kind of colonial sense, to imagine how public might be defined in an indigenous ontology or an indigenous way of knowing. To understand that there are other ways of understanding the world around us than how we might normally take it up is, I think, really important. Public art brings another layer of understanding to where we are, right? How about this, Ken Lum's Monument for East Vancouver? Anchors a sense of history, maybe a people's history. This is a huge, it's amazing to see at night too, right? It's kind of like glowing East Van cross. It's kind of lifted from, what used to be tags in the 70s and 80s. And this is pretty smart public art in a way, right? It resonates with a sense of history. It talks about a sense of place. And it certainly becomes a symbol for, a division in geography as well, right? That this demarks, Clark Drive. It's like you're in East Van proper. How about this one? Anish Kapoor's Cloud Gate, Chicago. Maybe you've seen this. You've gone under. You've taken pictures of yourself reflected in it. This is a certain scale. This is a very ambitious scale of kind of public art. It really is. It can feel like the plaza is built around this thing. As you can see, it's a gathering point, right? Public art helps to bring people together. It helps to create something other than maybe at least capitalist-driven, kind of viewing of public space. It creates a moment of kind of playful wonder, right? Douglas Copeland's Digital Orca from 2009. How you encounter, I don't know. I'm not showing you my favorite public works, just like to be clear. So everyone, all the cameras, they aren't my favorite public works, but these are examples of different ways that public art can work. And certainly Copeland kind of argues that this is a bit of a symbol of competing narratives in and around the different industries, different uses of public spaces in Vancouver and in BC. There's an orca, there's a kind of idea of like how traditional industries are shifting into digital industries, what changes over time. But, amongst all else, it's interesting that, not to say that this is always how it functions, right? But that somehow this becomes the tool to look at this, right? It's like somehow we didn't trust the public to just enjoy the landscape at the edge of the convention center. We needed to drop something there to kind of help us to tune in, look to the north. Okay. A work by one of my early mentors and really challenging and provocative Canadian artist, Noel Harding. This was a work from Ottawa called North Shore. And, in the later stage of his career, and maybe from earlier on, Noel was very interested in trees turning. When I was working with him in Windsor, Ontario, we worked for months and months to get this platform built that a tree turned very slowly based on a solar panel and kind of dry belt, very simple system. But to say that an idea that public art can also signal a future, right? And maybe a future that is interesting or provocative or impossible in the short term, but a future of some kind. And I think public art provokes imagination, right? Vanessa Kwan and Erica Stocking, the Hillcrest Geyser, also in Vancouver. This was part of a public art commission. The geyser erupts kind of in a manufactured sense. It uses stormwater and kind of wastewater to, maybe not wastewater. Let me rephrase it. They're not shooting wastewater up, but they're using those kinds of systems in hydraulic pumps to basically create this manufactured geyser, which I think is pretty interesting. And it becomes a space of play. It becomes a point of wonder. I think at the very least, this is what we hope public art does, right? It helps to create a certain sense of conviviality in spaces, and certainly when they're anchored. I'll just briefly criticize Douglas Copeland's gold Stanley Park tree that's placed around Marine Drive, and it's I'm not sure what that does, but certainly this work does something very different, and I appreciate it because it actually, it operates on a more human scale, right? That work on Marine Drive is, I don't know, for people on the SkyTrain or something, which is fine too. Okay, so I think we should ask, we ask what does public art do? What else can public art do? But I think we could also ask, what else can art be in public? Because art in public and public art have kind of branched off into different kinds of activities. And I'm going to try to advocate for this, because this is scalable, right? We can do this anywhere. But if we're expecting public art to not just be about an artwork that's in public, but is something that we kind of hope to drop off somewhere and people will figure out what to do with it, I think it's kind of missing the point. But art in public, that's kind of interesting. So, some quick works. Francis Elise, When Faith Moves Mountains. This was a video work, but also kind of socially engaged performative work. Got a lot of volunteers to basically move a pile of sand a foot further. It's kind of this totally impossible action that doesn't accomplish anything, but this huge symbolic weight and value and this document of a community coming together to accomplish it. Thomas Hirschhorn's Gramsci Monument from 2013 in the South Bronx. Thomas Hirschhorn has done a number of kind of large-scale monument types of works where he tries to kind of like take away from the focus of monument as like a singular thing and actually creates a community gathering point. In this case, with the help of a lot of kind of local labor, he created like a huge, almost kind of carnivalesque type of like open school, free learning environment, and a very, a kind of architecture that responds to the people's interests in real time. Park Fiction, has anyone heard of this? This is a project that's been around for a long time. This was a couple of artists that eventually gathered a lot of community members and worked with politicians and planners and architects and designers to basically make a park totally in the people's vision. So it's kind of ugly and doesn't totally function well, and there's weird things going on in it, but it got realized, and it took like over a decade to happen. But imagine if the mandate was that like planning needed to just like work with the community at all costs. It's an interesting proposition. I don't know if it's like translatable everywhere. But it came out of a bit of like tension with the developer, right? And certainly being in Vancouver, I have a certain interest in an affinity of like how can you respond to that kind of pressure? How can you respond to that kind of dynamic where it's a distortion really of like certainly market forces against real community interests? Suzanne Lacey's The Roof is on Fire. This was simply a series of conversations involving teenagers, high school students, talking about sex and drugs on a rooftop of buildings in Oakland. Parents, police officers could kind of walk by and like overhear, but they couldn't participate. This is about whose voice gets the center point, right? Whose voice gets kind of elevated to a level of people have to listen to it, and what happens when we actually start listening. Hannah Jickling and Helen Reed's amazing Big Rock Candy Mountain. This is a project where they're working with an elementary school in East Vancouver to basically make a candy factory and a tasting lab, working with, I think they're grade 7 students now. And they've produced like artist multiples as like candy bars. They currently have a public art commission from the city of Vancouver that's going to be a series, a gum that kids get to decide the flavors. They're going to manufacture like 20,000 pieces of this gum, and it'll get distributed as a public artwork. I think that this is the future of art, because this works with an unexpected community. It makes work that just would not otherwise exist in the world, and it becomes something that we experience at a totally human level, like we ingest the artwork, or we put it in our mouths for a little while. Don't ingest gum, right? But this is a really compelling way of working. And it's working in the wider public, but it's working with a very specific public, namely kids. And finally, Carmen Papalia's Blindfield Shuttle. He's a visually impaired artist, and he'll lead these tours around using his cane, and basically everyone behind him has their eyes closed and have to trust him guiding them through busy streets and intersections. And this is a very, again, a really interesting human scale way of thinking about art in public. And again, I would argue this doesn't cost, the $250,000 that a lot of public art, commissions cost. This is about trusting artists to do interesting things and trusting them to care about the community in which they're embedded, right? And I think that there are likely many, many artists in many, many smaller and rural communities that can do work that's equally interesting. So that's some of the background. These are some of the projects that are kind of moving around in my brain that keep me interested, that keep me kind of thinking about what I'm doing. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit now about the work that I did in Windsor, Ontario. Windsor, Ontario is a city of about 200,000 people. It's a post-industrial city. It was hit really hard by the automotive collapse in 2008, 2009. Detroit, all the headlines you saw, the $500 houses or whatever. Windsor's kind of like, Detroit is a future of Windsor that's like maybe 10 or 15 years down a particular road. And I think it's still up for grabs about which way that's going to go. But there's so many elements that go into telling a story about a place, right? So this is the story that you get when you're crossing the border through the Detroit International Tunnel, right? So when you arrive in Canada, this is the story you're getting. Seems kind of crazy. You get like half a maple leaf. right? You get some international brands and you get a line of cars. Like, to think about missed opportunities, right? This was a story about Windsor. This was another narrative that occurred, or that was written in the 1960s or 70s. This was a game plan that never actually got filled out. But I think it's very interesting to imagine that someone had, the ambition to think differently about what the future of that city could be like. But narratives are not just, architectural kind of lacks of ambition, and it's not just about official narratives that get buried in history. These are things happening in real time. Windsor's a toxic ground zero. Windsor's not a happy place. These are the stories we tell ourselves about a city like that. Windsor, there's nothing to do here. And then this kind of narrative, which is also amazing, that someone goes through the trouble of trying to get a narrative like this event, that tries to put this narrative out into the world. And that takes a lot of time to print stickers and, get them up and design them in Microsoft Word or whatever. And all of these things are interesting because they set the frame for what a narrative is, what a story is about where we live. And there's other stories that we could build. So with Broken City Lab, with these amazing people that I got the opportunity to work with while I was in Windsor, me and my partner co-founded it in 2008, and we continue to kind of work sort of ad hocly since then. But one of the earliest things we did was we thought about that border relationship, and we thought about Windsor and Detroit, and this, imagining that certainly at one point there would have been a very different relationship when there wasn't a border, and even thinking about the scope of our parents' generation, that there was you would have friends in downtown Detroit, you would go for dinner over there. It's not that way anymore. But we saw this as like a very, again, a kind of like infrastructure level narrative, but that basically the only thing lit up on the skyline is this like international casino that gets plopped down and pays the city of Windsor like $10 million a year or something that exists. And everything else kind of like struggles along with it. And that's an interesting set of priorities, right? So in response, we started going around with projectors like hanging up there on the ceiling and a car battery, and we started projecting messages back to Windsor, other narratives that might start to tell a different story, right? And mostly this kind of thing where we wanted to think differently about how we were going to be in relation to that community. And, in some ways the fact, you could see this from like Hart Plaza or in downtown Detroit. I don't know if there's anyone there, but what clicked in our brains was that this is being a citizen, right? This is deciding to do something in your community because you want to imagine your community differently, and then you do it. And that's kind of the core of what I think art is, and art in public can be in the 21st century, right? So we continued with this idea of like other narratives, other ways of talking about where we lived and how we lived. And we made this like cycle of never-ending lines of a story, and then the city started to feel better, and then the city kept doing the same thing it always did, and then the city made up for all its mistakes, and then the city started to feel a little different. And any of these things become kind of touch points where you might think it's one thing and I might think it's another. And that's public life, right? Where we can all find, like this one I think is really interesting, right? And then the city changed politics or whatever. Whatever that might mean to you, it may mean something different to the person sitting next to you right now. And I think that's kind of the compelling part, is that work like this allows so many multiple access points. And it's not just to say that like we're the only people working like this at all. Many great, let me say it like this, there are many amazing public art projects that accomplish that. I like to imagine that sometimes maybe this did for some people. But the possibility to think that like there are other ways to talk about and imagine how we are in the city became an underlying concern for what we did. We created this storefront pop-up space. I gotta say, I was walking around and I'm amazed that there are, as far as I can see, virtually no vacancies in your downtown. That's kind of great. Maybe there's like a second or third floor vacancy in like the old provincial building, which I think is a very cool building, I gotta say. Totally bizarre and weird, the round one. But it's like, that thing's pretty interesting. Anyway, so we created this storefront studio thing, and with the ambition of saying, like, what if artists and designers, emerging artists and designers, what if we just considered them outright as community leaders, right? So if we didn't say, like, oh, they're like the leaders of tomorrow, if we just said, no, they're leading the community right now, and we said we're going to make a storefront that tries to imagine that. So we just started commissioning artists and commissioning ourselves to make projects. One was the letter library, where you could come in and grab your stack of letters and a disposable camera and go out and, people could go and caption the city however they wanted, right? This was a youth who was, who was homeless, and he would come and hang out with us a lot. And he went and put this one up. Families coming by and just like kind of playing in space. And we created this huge like album, set of photos. And this is really easy. I'm not saying that all of these are like, the greatest things at all. What I'm saying is that like maybe for the first time someone came and like did something in their immediate environment that they had never thought to do before. And that's kind of what's really special to me about making art in public. We followed that up with like a kind of never-ending series of workshops and guest artists and people coming in and doing, guerrilla gardening things and imagining ways to remap their urban environments, to make kind of official responses to interesting kind of like whatever communication design plans. We hosted hacker spaces. We did a lot of screen printing. We did these kind of like tactile, like layering, replanning plans for ourselves. We made T-shirts of regrets and resolves. We gave people free tattoos of symbols of Windsor. You ever see the Windsor salt box? I don't know, you probably don't out here. But maybe in Winnipeg, I don't know. That's us, we did that. So there's a salt shaker for that. And basically we tried to animate this storefront on this street. I'll say sadly that behind this photo used to be another series of storefronts that they've since torn out and turned into more parking. But we ended up that project with this thing which was called the Best of Awards. And we said it's an emergency, that we're not recognizing all the amazing people that are here. We'll kind of like make up as many trophies as you can think of, and we'll kind of host this like special, goodbye for us, but also like a bit of a, like we've done, like we don't need to do anything more because you're already doing it. I think that kind of work is still really important. It takes a long time. It takes a different kind of scale of ambition. And I think it often takes people who are living and breathing and doing their thing in a community. And we need to find ways to kind of work with them where they're at. We need to find new platforms to kind of invite people out of the woodwork to do the work they're doing in other kinds of public spaces and other kind of community settings. We were lucky enough that we were supported by like the Ontario Trillium Foundation and various arts councils to do this kind of work, but it was like we were kind of already doing it, and then the opportunities just came up. So I'm pretty sure there are people in this area that are already doing this. We just need to find new ways to invite them to other scales of opportunities. I think that other conversations can happen in public art because we're not thinking that it's necessarily like a conversation that is like world-changing, right? We may not place a lot of kind of value in what's at stake in making art in public, but actually I think it can be really transformative. And in part, that it flies under the radar is kind of like what makes it so great. So I created this work where it was like this, you may have seen something similar in a boardroom near you. You have these posters, you get these kind of stickers, you go and vote, like which ones do you agree with, whatever. And I had these series of kind of contentious statements, and this was in Saskatoon as part of the Street Meat Festival. And what was amazing is that you get, basically some of these things are, timely or important, like better decision making comes from those not in the position to make the decision. Where there's more justice and where there's more equity, everyone has capacity to act in the world on their interests and what they want to imagine the world being. And we gotta trust one another to do that. But we need to rehearse it. We're not good at it yet. We gotta get better, so we need to carve out moments where we can try it on, where we can try and do it where there's not a lot at stake, so that when the real opportunity comes, we can be better with one another. Some of the opportunities I had to work with, as Bev mentioned, the City of Vancouver's Sustainability Department, came about because of this other work I had done, where it was like about a kind of like engagement or communication thing. And in this case, I started this residency, which lasted, kind of end to end, about 18 months. And I started with these interviews. I would sit with each staff member in sustainability and ask them questions like, so in this case, it's like, how do you think someone makes meaning from information? Or what makes something meaningful, something you can act on? So asking them to reflect a little bit, not so directly, on like the ways that they're currently operating communication plans, let's say, or engagement strategies. And is it accomplishing what they want to do? And in part, me being just an artist and just a citizen, I get to kind of like ask questions that maybe they're not asking themselves, and I think in that way, the residency was really valuable. And certainly it changed how I think about my practice, but I think for them, it became this like other lens on what they were doing that that just wasn't available before. So I would hold workshops and help them to kind of map out other engagement strategies. We would come up with, like maybe potential things that they might be able to get off the ground one day. I'd go through, lots of planning documents and try and comment and just give them another perspective. Try to like ask them questions that they weren't able to ask themselves. And eventually, those kinds of questions lead to this work that I created more recently, which is the Should I Be Worried piece. So this is along False Creek. This is it going up. And this is kind of what it looks like. So this work that captions, again, kind of the city skyline. It's along the Canby Bridge. It's along False Creek. And it comes out of all of those conversations I had. So it's like a slow burn, right? We need to make room for artists to like spend time thinking and being with people that they might not normally get to bump into, right? Because out of that comes something that, maybe not everybody likes this, but I think it is an interesting addition to the scope of other kinds of public art that are going on in Vancouver. And in this way, it's a check-in, right? You ask yourself, should I be worried about like that crane I see, that they're building up on the other side? Should I be worried about the potential of sea level rise because I'm right at the foot of False Creek, and when it's like king tide time of season, it's like that's getting dangerously close. You start to scale your thinking differently. And I think that what public art does is like builds out an opportunity for that to happen. I'm also thinking in a lot of the work I do about the ways in which like experiential practice and community collaboration can not only make a project possible, but drive the work behind it, right? So early on with Broken City Lab, we created the Storefront Residencies for Social Innovation. These were in downtown Windsor. We leased the storefronts for like $1 from the city for the entire summer. And we just brought artists in saying, what if we thought that like storefronts that were empty weren't a failure, but were like an on-purpose opportunity to do something else with that space? So we stopped looking at it as like, whoa, the downtown's like 50% vacancy rate. And we thought like the downtown is like 50% potential rate, like something is yet to happen. So we brought in artists to do, a bunch of weird and wacky projects. And in some cases they were like drawing with gunpowder, and in some cases they were just like holding like after school like art events. In other cases they were doing a storefront consultancy, so they would like invite other businesses that were downtown, and they would use like their skills and artists and designers to basically help them, like think through what it is that they wanted their downtown to become. And this kind of work relied on a lot of different participants, but also relied on like, basically the permission that we tried to provide to have a different kind of conversation than what that downtown was about. Work like that, as I showed before, led to Civic Space, which then led to the Neighborhood Spaces Residency. This was an interesting partnership between the Arts Council, Windsor and Region, the City of Windsor, and with us, Broken City Lab, where we identified partners that we could put artists with. So basically, there's artists that worked with unemployment agencies, artists that worked with senior centers and created community radio stations for the senior center, worked with the youth center and had music lessons, worked with historical societies and basically created new walking tours. Basically, we said, what would you do, the community organization, we said, if you had an artist come in here for a month, what might you ask them to do? And for artists, we said, if you had an opportunity to work outside of the art world, what would you do? And that kind of mingling, that kind of opportunity to do something outside of what you're normally doing, I think creates really compelling opportunities. And again, this is art in public. I think it's a kind of public art, but it's something that's really scalable and doable, right? The ultimate version of this project is something like, everybody who's got a porch or a back room or a shed, if you want an artist in residence, we make a community plan where every block has an artist in residence. And we think about that kind of surplus of space and the surplus of potential that are in the artists already in the community, and we build something out. That kind of thinking led to this proposition for the Neighborhood Time Exchange, which looked something similar to that, but we tried to imagine that the value there is that artists have a certain amount of capacity and ability. They have time, but they may not have space. And in particular, neighborhoods that are in transition or neighborhoods that are changing, neighborhoods that are maybe particularly challenged, they could benefit from, dare I say, like an artist touch, but they also have space to give that artists might normally not have access to. So we started this out in Philadelphia with the Mural Arts Project. So just to give you a bit more context, this is kind of a process to come into the time exchange if you wanted to ask for some help if you were a neighbor. But Mural Arts Philadelphia was doing 30 years of murals, right? They have done hundreds and hundreds of murals all over the community. And oftentimes they were, it was a really good process. But they were interested in asking, so what's next? So how else can we create a portrait of a community, right? Or a portrait of an issue? And this kind of, infrastructure potential came about. So if you were in West Philly and you were interested in like getting some help doing something, you could come into our storefront and ask for help. And we would get an artist who's in residence lined up to give you a hand with that. So in some cases, this was Miss Betty in the center there, and she was making curtains for the local church because that's what they needed. But she got like a storefront for 3 months for free. This artist was helping people to digitize like old Super 8 home videos. He got a storefront for free. Another artist was working to do silkscreen workshops. Another artist was helping to clear out this lot to make new kind of containers basically for some of the lots that were overgrown. Even simple things like there were boarded up homes that were dangerous. Artists came in and worked with community members to design the things that could go over the windows and keep those places safe. Artists work with local elementary schools to make like alternative Black history videos. An amazing artist worked with another school to build like an autistic sensory room. So using her aesthetics, using her kind of way of working, she built out something that's her in the background, built out something that just wasn't existing otherwise. And that was so amazing because what happened here is that the school's like, maybe we should have our own artists in residence. And I'm like, yeah, that's what's possible, is like saying where else can artists be in society and what else can artists bring to the world around them. And I think that's sort of the answers there are potentially endless. This was a really beautiful project and really hard, and it didn't go exactly how I'd hoped. But Mural Arts is now doing another version of this in another neighborhood, so there's some value, there's something learned from this. And I'll say that we took a similar kind of framework and brought it up to Prince George and worked with the Business Improvement Association there and did another year of residencies that basically partnered artists with organizations, but also somehow, like totally accidentally, but just because we hired the right local people who were already there. And they've built an artist-run center out of thin air, and it's an amazing music venue, and it's a beautiful kind of community gathering place. But that's like long-form placemaking. So I want to like think about placemaking and the role that art has in it. It's not just like putting something there and now it's that place is made, but to think about placemaking as a slow burn process that takes months and years to do. And you can't see the results when you first do it, but you set things in motion, you trust people who are here to work with people who may be coming from away, and you do something that's really transformative. So I'm gonna try and keep this pretty tight actually to about 40 minutes. And I'm gonna end with some propositions for making art in public. And these things are this is like what I think it'll be even more fun to have a bit of a conversation about what these might mean or might not mean here. But again, crucially, it's about making art in public as, if you even want to think about it this way, maybe as like a starting point for thinking about larger, grander, more expensive public artworks over time. But making art in public is a key takeaway tonight. So I would say that the role of art in civic life needs to be reinvented on new terms. I think I've tried to show a number of projects that example this tonight. But most important, art in civic life is something that is fluid and social and relational and like a moving target, right? So art in public, we kind of imagine in public being a particular space or a description of a kind of space or a space that has a certain sort of potential. But civic life is like fluid and ongoing and constant and moving and like unstable, and all of these great unruly things. And that's an interesting space to make art out of. But I think it requires us to think differently about what art looks like and what it can do. I would say that artists working in public need not conform to existing publics. What we identify as being like a recipient of an artist, the place, a community, maybe, but maybe there's an entirely new configuration of people and interests and affinities and disagreements that could produce something truly novel and truly responsive to the place in which it's held, right, and the place in which it's hosted. And artists that want to do this, want to think about working this way, I think are everywhere. We just haven't asked them, we haven't given them the right invitation yet. Art in a place is not necessarily the same as art of a place. And I grew up in a community of like 6,000 people, and there was a youth center, and there was like 12 people between like grades 9 and 12 that went to this youth center on a given day, and we made a lot of stuff though. And I learned something from that experience, which is like, I learned how to make something of a place because we had only ourselves to rely on. And I think scaling that up to art means that like, it is important to work with people from away because we learn things from that kind of exchange. But there's also a way to make art of a place. And that takes time, and that takes a certain amount of trust and a certain amount of experimentation. But art in a place, art in a public place is definitely a distinct thing from making art of a place. And a smaller community is the perfect kind of setting to develop art of a place. I would argue that engagement isn't a means to an end. It's a way of working with and in publics. So you can't just say engagement, oh, we're going to do engagement on this. We need some more engagement on this thing, and then we'll be good to go to the next step. Engagement should describe a way of working with and in publics. And what this leads to on the other side is obviously part of what engagement produces. But in what I've learned from working with the City of Vancouver, for example, in the sustainability group, is that sometimes, and not because anyone's doing it with any kind of ill will, but it's just there are certain expectations that the word engagement carries, and I don't know if it's adequately like capturing what we hope it would do, or if it's actually responding enough to the terms of basically capacity of a community in which we're asking for that engagement. We need to see this as part of a process. And finally, I think more than anything else, the process that gets defined enables, limits, and defines everything that will come out of public art. And I've like in the last year, I've sat on a few different juries for public art projects in Vancouver, and some of them have been like really large commissions. And what we found, I mean, no big surprise, is that artists who are coming from marginalized communities, artists who are certainly indigenous artists who may have ways of practicing that don't look like big and shiny objects dropped in space, they have a hard time getting through commission processes. And we all need to do way better to not only help to make those projects more possible, but we need to actively build space for people who don't look like me and people who don't produce the work that I showed you up front, because that is what public art should be in the future, because that captures diversity, it captures difference, and it captures something that's like magical because it describes a different kind of world. And I'm interested, as I'm sure many of you are, we're interested in building something that's better than what we found it in, right? And I think that making sure that the process that we engage, whether it's creating a new mural or creating a large public art commission or creating a new sort of like community engaged project, that the process considers all of the barriers from the beginning so that we can get it right and we can make more room for people that haven't always had the room. So I'm going to leave it there and say thank you. And this was a lot of fun, and hopefully I'll have some good conversation. Thanks.